Once, in a quiet village, there lived a humble peasant named Pahom, a man of simple needs yet burdened by a growing desire. He often heard the wealthy landlords speak of their vast estates, their fertile fields, their endless meadows, and he envied them. One evening, as Pahom sat with his wife, listening to her speak of the simple joys of rural life, he clenched his fists and declared, "If I had enough land, I wouldn't fear the devil himself." His words drifted into the night, unheard by all, except one. In the shadows, unseen, the devil smiled. Time passed. One day a stranger arrived in the village, speaking of a land sale. A local noblewoman, burdened by debt, was selling her property, and the peasants had a chance to buy it. Pahom saw this as fate. He gathered his savings, borrowed from his relatives, and purchased a small portion of the land. For the first time, Pahom was a landowner. He plowed the soil, sowed his seeds, and watched the earth reward his labor. He felt proud, powerful, but soon a whisper crept into his heart. It is not enough. He wanted more. One day, a traveling merchant told Pahom of a distant land, the land of the Bashkirs. "They are simple folk," the merchant said, his voice low, tempting. "They offer land for almost nothing, as much as a man can walk in a day, all for a single gift." Pahom's heart pounded. As much as I can walk? He could already see it. Endless fields stretching beyond the horizon. Rich, dark soil beneath his feet. Land, truly his own. He made up his mind. At sunrise he set off toward the land of the Bashkirs. After days of travel, Pahom arrived at their settlement. The Bashkirs welcomed him with open arms, their laughter warm, their eyes gleaming with simplicity. They did not care for gold or riches. Instead, they valued gifts and kindness. Pahom, eager to please, presented them with fine tea, silk, and wine. The Bashkirs, delighted, offered him a deal. "For 1,000 rubles, their elder said, you may have all the land you can walk in one day, but there is one condition. You must return to the starting point by sundown. If you do not, you lose it all." Pahom's eyes burned with hunger. He nodded. "I will walk far," he whispered, "and I will take it all." The next morning, as the first rays of the sun painted the sky in gold, Pahom stood barefoot on the cool earth. Before him stretched a vast, untouched land, waiting to be his. A Bashkir elder placed a small mound of earth at his feet. "This is your starting point," the elder said. "Mark it well." Pahom tightened his belt, wiped the sweat from his brow, and took his first step. At first, he walked with ease, the wind cooling his skin. The land was fertile, soft under his heels. A fine spot for wheat, he thought. He made a mark on the ground and moved on. He walked farther, perhaps a little more. Just to be safe, the sun rose higher. The sky burned. Sweat dripped from his brow. He wiped it away and pressed on. "I must keep going. I can rest later." His legs ached, his breath grew heavy, but he did not stop. He wanted the land beyond the hill, the land by the river, the land stretching toward the horizon. It would all be his. Yet, when he looked back, the starting point was a distant speck. A shadow of doubt flickered in his mind. I should turn back. But then he thought, just a little more. He walked until noon, marking corners, claiming more. But the sun hung high now, glaring down like an angry eye. The heat pressed against his skin, his feet throbbed, his legs trembled, his heart pounded. I must return, he turned around. The starting point seemed impossibly far. Fear clenched his chest. Pahom forced himself forward, his steps quicker, desperate. Each breath burned. The sun inched toward the horizon, casting long shadows. The Bashkirs stood at the starting point, watching. Some smiled, some whispered. The elder waited. The sun dipped lower. Pahom ran. His lungs screamed, his vision blurred, the world swayed. But he ran. Just a little more. He stumbled. The ground rose to meet him. He pushed himself up. His heart pounded like a drum of war. The sun touched the edge of the sky. The mound of earth was near. Pahom gasped, his chest heaving. His fingers brushed the Y. Starting point. He had made it. A cry of triumph rose in his throat. But in that moment his body failed him. His heart, swollen with greed, beat one final time. And then silence. The Bashkir elder stepped forward. Slowly he bent down and gazed at Pahom's still body. Then, with quiet reverence, he called for a spade. A small grave was dug, just enough for a man to lie in, 6 feet of earth. This, the elder murmured, is all the land a man truly needs. The wind whispered through the open fields, rustling the grass that now covered Pahom's final resting place. The Bashkirs stood in silence, their laughter from the morning long gone. Some bowed their heads, others simply turned away. The elder, the one who had offered the deal, let out a deep sigh. He had seen this before. He would see it again. A man runs after the earth, he murmured, his voice almost lost in the breeze, until the earth takes him. He pressed the mound of soil firmly with his foot, as if to mark the lesson forever. Far away, in Pahom's village, his wife waited. She watched the road, expecting him to return, triumphant, smiling, with the wealth of new land beneath his feet. But the road remained empty. The days passed, then weeks. The news came slowly, carried by passing travelers. At first, she did not believe it. He was strong, she whispered. He would not fall. But the truth settled, like cold stone in her chest. Her husband had gone, chasing the dream of endless land, and in the end, he had needed only 6 feet of earth. But the story did not end there, not in this village, not in this world. In another town, miles away, another man sat by his fire. His eyes, sharp with ambition, flickered in the firelight. He had heard the tale of Pahom, of his greed, his fall, and yet he did not shudder, he did not turn away. Instead, he laughed. A fool's mistake, he muttered. He should have planned better, walked less, marked his land wisely. He leaned forward, his fingers tightening around his cup. If it were me, I would have taken the land and survived. Outside, in the darkness, something listened, and in the quiet, unseen, the devil smiled once more. The fire crackled, casting long shadows against the walls of the small tavern. The man, whose name was Ivan, took another sip from his cup, his lips curling into a smirk. Pahom was a fool, he muttered. He let his greed outrun his legs. A true man knows how to take only as much as he can carry. The other villagers, seated around him, listened in silence. Some nodded, some avoided his gaze. They had all heard of Pahom's fate. They knew that the earth had claimed him, that his greed had led him to ruin, but Ivan did not fear the tale. I would not make his mistake, he continued, leaning forward. If I were given that chance, I would return before sundown. I would take the land and keep my life. He laughed, shaking his head. If only I had such an opportunity. And in that moment, a wind passed through the tavern, though no doors had opened. The candles flickered. A shadow, unseen by the rest, curled in the corner of the room, and the devil, who had been listening as he always did, smiled once more. Days passed. Then weeks. The harvest season arrived, and Ivan worked his fields with the strength of 10 men. He was not a poor peasant like Pahom had been. He owned a fair amount of land, but still he felt it was not enough. If I had more, he often muttered to himself, wiping the sweat from his brow. If I had more, I would truly be a rich man. One evening, as he rested beneath an old oak tree, a traveler approached. The man wore simple clothes, yet his eyes gleamed with an unusual light. He carried no cart, no goods, only a small leather bag tied at his waist. "You look like a man who works hard," the stranger said. Ivan sat up, narrowing his eyes. "That I do," the stranger smiled. "And yet I can see that you are not content." Ivan scoffed. "Who is truly content? A man may have fields, but he always dreams of meadows. A man may have meadows, but he always dreams of rivers. Such is life. The stranger nodded. "And what if I told you," he said, his voice slow, almost hypnotic, "that I know of a place where land is given freely? As much as a man can walk in a day, for a single gift?" Ivan froze. The words felt familiar. He had heard them before. In the tale of Pahom. He hesitated. "What is the catch?" he asked. The stranger chuckled, shaking his head. "Only one rule. You must return to the starting point by sundown." Silence fell between them. Ivan's heart pounded. "Where is this land?" he asked. The stranger leaned in. "Beyond the hills. Travel east, and you will find the Bashkirs." Ivan exhaled slowly. His mind raced. The old story of Pahom flickered in his thoughts, but he pushed it aside. He was different. He was stronger, smarter. He would not make the same mistake. He would take the land and return before sundown. The next morning, before the sun had risen, Ivan set out on his journey. He did not tell his wife nor his neighbors. He did not need their warnings, their doubts. He was a man of action. As he walked, the land stretched before him, vast, open, untouched. His hunger grew. All this could be mine. The thought thrilled. Him. The hills rolled beneath his feet. The rivers whispered as he passed. The path led him farther than he expected, but he did not turn back. He could not turn back, and then, at last, he arrived. The Bashkirs stood waiting, just as in the old tale. Their laughter was warm, their eyes kind. They welcomed him with food and drink, treating him as an honored guest, and when the moment came, their elder stepped forward, just as before. "For 1,000 rubles," the elder said, "you may have all the land you can walk in one day. But you must return to the starting point before sundown, or you will lose everything." Ivan smiled. "I accept." As the first light of dawn painted the sky, Ivan stood at the starting point. The land before him was untouched, endless. He took a deep breath, tightening his belt, readying himself. The elder placed a small mound of earth before him. "Mark this well," he said. Ivan nodded, and then, without hesitation, he took his first step. At first, his pace was steady, calculated. He would not let greed control him. He would mark the land wisely, keeping the starting point in sight. The wind was cool, the soil soft beneath his feet. "This land will be mine," he murmured. He marked a corner, then another. Enough for a grand estate, he thought, but then he saw the meadow beyond. A little more won't hurt. He walked farther. Then a river appeared on the horizon, its waters shimmering under the sun. "Perhaps I should take the land by the river as well." He marked another point. The sun rose higher. Sweat gathered at his brow. He wiped it away, pressing forward. Just a little more. The heat grew unbearable. His legs ached. He turned back, and a jolt of panic gripped him. The starting point was nothing but a speck. The sun had passed its peak. Ivan swallowed hard. It's time to return. He turned on his heels and quickened his pace, but the land he had claimed stretched wide, too wide. He had walked too far, and the sun, it was falling fast. His breath came in sharp gasps. His muscles burned. His vision blurred. "I must make it back." He ran. The Bashkirs stood in the distance, waiting. The elder watched in silence. The sun kissed the edge of the sky. Ivan's heart pounded. His chest ached. The starting point was so close. Just a little more. His foot caught on a stone. He stumbled. The world spun. And then darkness. The earth rose up to meet him. The impact sent a jolt through his body, knocking the wind from his lungs. He gasped, clawing at the ground, his fingers digging into the dry soil. No, he could not stop. Not now. The sun was sinking fast. An angry, red eye glaring down at him, mocking him. The shadows stretched longer, reaching for him like grasping hands. He had come too far to fail. With a groan, Ivan forced himself to his knees. His heart pounded, hammering like a war drum. His legs trembled, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed forward, step by step. In the distance, the Bashkirs watched in silence. Their laughter from the morning had faded. Now they only waited. The elder stood at the starting point, his eyes calm, unreadable. Ivan staggered toward him, his vision swimming. His body screamed for rest, but he would not listen. He would reach the mound of earth. He would claim his land. One more step. One more. The sun touched the horizon. The sky bled red and gold. The final stretch lay before him. Just a few paces more. A cry tore from Ivan's throat. He summoned the last of his strength, throwing himself forward. His feet dragged, his arms flailed, his body swayed, but he did not stop. He lunged for the mound of earth. His fingers grazed the soil. And then, silence. His body collapsed. His chest heaved once, twice, and then nothing. The wind whispered. The world stood still. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the Bashkir elder stepped forward. He bent down, pressing his fingers against Ivan's neck. He waited, and then, with quiet finality, he straightened. "It is done," he murmured. A hush fell over the group. The Bashkirs did not speak. There was no need. One of the younger men retrieved a spade. The elder nodded. Without hesitation, they began to dig. The earth, so eagerly claimed, was now being returned. The grave was shallow, just enough for a man to lie in, 6 feet of earth. "This," the elder said, his voice soft, "is all the land a man truly needs." He pressed the soil firmly, patting it down with his hands. The wind carried his words away. The Bashkirs turned and walked back toward their camp, their faces unreadable. The Ikat land remained unchanged. The field stretched endlessly, golden beneath the fading sun. It was still there, waiting for the next man to come. But the story does not end here, not in this world, not ever. Far away, in another village, another man sat at his table. The firelight flickered against his face, his eyes gleaming with ambition. He had heard the tale of Ivan, he had heard the tale of Pahom, but he did not fear it. "A fool's mistake," he muttered, shaking his head. "They were weak. I would not make the same error." His fingers tightened around his cup. "If it were me, I would take the land and return before sundown." Outside, in the darkness, something listened. And in the quiet, unseen, the devil smiled once more. The cycle begins again. The wind howled through the empty fields, carrying with it the whispers of those who had come before. The soil, freshly turned, bore no name, no marker, just a simple mound of earth. Ivan had found his land at last, though not in the way he had dreamed. The Bashkirs left the site in silence, their figures disappearing over the horizon. The sun had set, and with it another tale had ended. But the world did not stop. Life moved on, indifferent to the fate of a single man. And somewhere, in another village, far from the land Ivan had claimed, a new story was beginning. The tavern was alive with the hum of voices. The scent of ale and roasted meat filled the air, and men sat gathered around wooden tables, their faces flushed with drink and laughter. At one such table sat Dmitri, a man of sharp wit and sharper ambition. He leaned back in his chair, his boots propped against the edge of the table, as he listened to the tale being told. "A fool's end," the storyteller finished, shaking his head. "The man ran himself to death, thinking he could own the land. But in the end, the land owned him." The men around the table chuckled, murmuring their agreements. But Dmitri only smirked, swirling the ale in his cup. He was weak, he said. The laughter faded. A few men exchanged wary glances. Dmitri took a slow sip of his drink before setting the cup down. "Think about it," he continued. He let his greed outrun his sense. If he had been smarter, he would have marked his land carefully, taken only what he could handle, and he would have walked back in time. The storyteller frowned. "You think you could do better?" Dmitri's smirk widened. "I know I could." A shadow flickered in the corner of the room, unseen, unheard. A cold draft swept through the tavern, though no doors had opened. The storyteller leaned forward, his voice quiet. "Then perhaps you should go east, beyond the hills. The Bashkirs are still there, and their offer still stands." Dmitri raised an eyebrow. "A fairy tale," he scoffed, but the man only shrugged. Believe what you will, but if you're so certain of your strength, why not prove it? Dmitri chuckled, shaking his head. He tossed a few coins onto the table and rose to his feet. Perhaps I will. And with that, he stepped out into the night, never noticing the shadow that followed close behind. The road stretched long and empty before him. The wind carried whispers, soft, distant, but Dmitri paid them no mind. He was not Pahom. He was not Ivan. He was not a fool. The journey took days. He crossed rivers and meadows, climbed hills and descended into valleys. And then, just as the storyteller had said, he found them. The Bashkirs welcomed him with open arms, their laughter warm, their smiles wide. They feasted together, drinking deep into the night, and when the morning sun rose, the elder stepped forward, his expression calm, unreadable. "For 1,000 rubles, the elder said, you may have all the land you can walk in one day, but you must return before sundown, or you will lose everything." Dmitri smiled. "I accept." At dawn, he stood at the starting point. The land stretched vast before him, untouched, endless. His heart raced with excitement. The elder placed a small mound of earth before him. "Mark this well," he said. Dmitri nodded. The sun crested the horizon. And then, without hesitation, he took his first step. At first, he followed his plan. He would not be reckless. He would take only as much as he could handle. He walked steadily, marking his corners carefully. A large field, fertile and rich, perfect for growing crops. But then, beyond the field, he saw a river. A little more won't hurt, he thought. If I take the land by the river, I will have water for my fields. He walked farther. Then, past the river, he saw a cluster of hills. Hills make good pasture for livestock. I should take those too. The sun rose higher. Sweat gathered at his brow. He wiped it away, pressing forward. Just a little more. The heat grew unbearable. His legs ached. He turned back, and a jolt of panic gripped him. The starting point was barely visible, and the sun, it was falling fast. A sharp wind howled through the empty land. The world seemed to stretch farther, the distance mocking him. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I still have time." He turned and began the long walk back, but with each step the sun dipped lower. His breath came in sharp gasps. His muscles burned. His vision blurred. The Bashkirs stood in the distance, waiting. The elder watched in silence. Dmitri's heart pounded. His chest ached. Just a little more. The starting point was so close, he ran. His feet dragged, his body swayed. The sun kissed the edge of the sky. Almost there. Darkness closed in at the edges of his vision. His lungs burned. His legs failed him, but he would not stop. Not yet. Not now. With the last ounce of his strength, he lunged forward, his fingers grazing the mound of earth. And then silence. His body collapsed. His chest heaved once, twice, and then nothing. The wind whispered. The world stood still. The Bashkir elder knelt beside him. He pressed his fingers to Dmitri's throat. Waited. Then he straightened. "It is done," he murmured. The others said nothing. One of the younger men retrieved a spade. The elder nodded. Without hesitation, they began to dig. The grave was shallow, just enough for a man to lie in, 6 feet of earth. "This," the elder said, "is all the land a man truly needs." He pressed the soil down, patting it firmly. The wind carried his words away. The Bashkirs turned and walked back toward their camp, their figures fading into the twilight. The land remained unchanged. The field stretched endlessly, golden beneath the darkening sky. It was still there, waiting for the next man to come. The night was silent. The stars blinked coldly in the vast sky, indifferent to what had transpired below. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth, the only marker of Dmitri's final resting place. The Bashkirs had long since disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the whispering grass and the endless expanse of land. But the world did not mourn him. The land did not grieve. It remained as it always had, waiting, stretching endlessly, untouched by the desires of men, and far away in another village, another man sat by his fire. His name was Alexei, and he had just heard the tale. The inn was warm, filled with the scent of roasted meat and old wood. The laughter of merchants and farmers echoed through the dimly lit room. At the farthest table, Alexei leaned in, listening closely to the storyteller's words. And so, the old man said, his voice low and steady, Dmitri was buried in the very land he tried to claim. 6 feet of earth, no more, no less. The same as Pahom before him, the same as the others before that. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some men shook their heads, others laughed nervously. A few made the sign of the cross. But Alexei only smirked. Fools, he muttered under his breath. The storyteller heard him and raised an eyebrow. You doubt the tale? He asked. Alexei shrugged, taking a sip from his cup. I don't doubt the story, he said. Only the men in it. They lost because they were careless, because they didn't know how to control themselves. The old man studied him. And you think you could do better? Alexei chuckled. I know I could. Silence settled over the table. The storyteller leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Then why not prove it? Alexei met his eyes. Maybe I will. The idea took root in his mind that night, growing like a seed in fertile soil. Why shouldn't he? Go? He was stronger, faster, smarter than those before him. He wouldn't be reckless. He would take only what he needed, and when he returned home, his land would make him rich beyond measure. By morning his mind was set. He would go east, he would find the Bashkirs, and he would claim his share of the endless land. The journey was. Long days passed as he crossed fields and rivers, climbed hills and descended valleys. The road stretched endlessly before him, but Alexei did not waver. He was determined. Finally, on the 12th day, he saw them, the Bashkirs. Just as the stories had said, they welcomed him with laughter and kindness. They feasted together, drinking, deep into the night, and when the morning sun rose, the elder stepped forward, his face unreadable. For 1,000 rubles, he said, you may have all the land you can walk in one day, but you must return before sundown, or you will lose everything. Alexei smiled. I accept. At dawn he stood at the starting point. The land stretched vast and untouched before him, the golden fields whispering in the wind. The elder placed a small mound of earth before him. Mark this well, he said. Alexei nodded. The sun crested the horizon, and then, with steady determination, he took his first step. He moved carefully, marking his corners wisely. A broad, fertile field, enough to farm for generations. But then, beyond the field he saw a river. A little more won't hurt, he thought. With water, I could grow anything. So he walked farther. Then, past the river, he saw rolling hills. Hills are good for grazing livestock, he reasoned. I should take those too. The sun climbed higher. His legs burned, but he pressed on, just a little more. When he finally turned back, a chill ran through him. The starting point was barely visible, and the sun, it was already past noon. Panic gripped his chest. Had he gone too far? No, he still had time. If he moved quickly, he could make it back. So he began to run. The land blurred around him, the golden fields stretching endlessly. His heart pounded, his breath came in ragged gasps. The Bashkirs stood in the distance, waiting. The elder watched in silence. Alexei's body screamed for rest, but he did not stop. He could see the mound of earth now. Almost there. The sun touched the horizon. His vision swam. His legs buckled. Just a little more. Darkness closed in at the edges of his sight. His chest ached. His head spun. But he would not stop. Not yet. Not now. With one final surge of strength, he threw himself forward, his fingers grazing the mound of earth, and then silence. His body collapsed. His chest rose once, twice, and then nothing. The wind whispered. The world stood still. The Bashkir elder knelt beside him. He pressed his fingers to Alexei's throat. Waited. Then he straightened. It is done, he murmured. No. One spoke. A young man retrieved a spade. The elder nodded. Without hesitation, they began to dig. The grave was shallow, just enough for a man to lie in, 6 feet of earth. "This," the elder said, "is all the land a man truly needs." He pressed the soil down, patting it firmly. The wind carried his words away. The Bashkirs turned and walked back toward their camp, their figures fading into the twilight. The land remained unchanged. The field stretched endlessly, golden beneath the darkening sky. It was still there, waiting for the next man to come. The wind swept over the empty fields, rustling the grass where Alexei had fallen. The earth had been turned once more, burying another man who had sought to take more than he could carry. The Bashkirs did not linger. They had seen this happen before. They would see it happen again. And so they disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind only the endless land, waiting for its next visitor. Far away in a different village, another man heard the tale. His name was Sergei, and he too thought himself different. The tavern was alive with chatter and laughter, but Sergei sat in silence, swirling the wine in his cup, listening to the old storyteller weave his tale. "And so Alexei fell," the old man said, "just like the ones before him, just like the ones after him will." The men around the fire shook their heads. "Greedy fool," one muttered. "They all are," said another. "No man can have all the land he desires." Sergei exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. "That's where you're wrong," he said. The room quieted. The old storyteller narrowed his eyes. "You think you could do better?" Sergei smirked. "I don't think I know." The storyteller studied him for a long moment before leaning forward. "Then why not prove it?" The word sent a shiver through the air, a challenge, an invitation. Sergei held the man's gaze, his smirk widening. "Perhaps I will." The next morning he set out. The journey was long, just as it had been for the others. The road stretched before him, winding through hills and forests, crossing rivers and valleys. But Sergei was patient. He was careful. He was not like the fools before him. 12 days later, he arrived. And just as the stories had said, the Bashkirs welcomed him with laughter and warmth. They feasted together, drinking deep into the night, their voices rising in song beneath the endless sky. And when the morning came, the elder stepped forward, his face calm, unreadable. "For 1,000 rubles," he said, "you may have all the land you can walk in one day. But you must return before sundown, or you will lose everything." Sergei smiled. "I accept." At dawn he stood at the starting point, the golden field stretching. Before him, like a promise, the elder placed a small mound of earth at his feet. "Mark this well," he said. Sergei nodded. The sun rose, and he took his first step. He moved with precision, marking his land carefully. A broad field for farming, a river for water, a forest for timber. He was not reckless. He would not be like the others. The sun climbed higher, and still he pressed on. Beyond the forest he saw a hill, perfect for a home. A little more won't hurt, he thought. So he walked farther. And past the hill, a valley, rich, fertile, untouched. Just a little. More. The sun was now at its peak. Sweat clung to his skin. He turned, and panic struck. The starting point was a distant speck, and the sun, it was already past noon. He had taken too much. No, he still had time. If he moved quickly, he could make it back. So he began to run. The land blurred around him, the wind roaring in his ears. His heart pounded. His breath came in short, desperate gasps. The Bashkirs stood in the distance, waiting. The elder watched in silence. Sergei's legs burned, his chest ached, but he would not stop. He could see the mound of earth now, almost there. The sun touched the horizon. His vision blurred, his body swayed. Just a little more. Darkness closed in at the edges of his sight. His legs buckled. His lungs burned, but he would not stop. Not yet. Not now. With the last of his strength, he lunged forward, his fingers grazing the mound of earth, and then silence. The world stood still. The Bashkir elder knelt beside him. He pressed his fingers to Sergei's throat. Waited. Then he straightened. "It is done," he murmured. No one spoke. A young man retrieved a spade. The elder nodded. Without hesitation, they began to dig. The grave was shallow, just enough for a man to lie in, 6 feet of earth. "This," the elder said, "is all the land a man truly needs." He pressed the soil down, patting it firmly. The wind carried his words away. The Bashkirs turned and walked back toward their camp, their figures fading into the twilight. The land remained unchanged. The field stretched endlessly, golden beneath the darkening sky. It was still there, waiting for the next man to come. The night wind whispered through the fields, carrying the faint echoes of past footsteps. Men who had walked this land, seeking to claim what could never truly belong to them. The grave was fresh, the soil still dark and loose. Yet by morning the earth would settle, and soon no trace of Sergei would remain. The Bashkirs did not grieve. They did not question fate. They had seen it too many times before, and they knew they would see it again. Far from those fields, in another village, another man sat by his fire. His name was Ivan, and he had just heard the tale. The tavern was quiet that evening, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and damp wood. A few men sat huddled around a fire, their faces half lit by the flickering glow. The storyteller's voice was calm, steady. He spoke as though he had told the story 100 times before. "And so," he finished, "the earth took Sergei, just as it had taken the others. 6 feet of land, no more, no less." Ivan leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. "Fools," he muttered. The storyteller's gaze flickered toward him. "You doubt the tale?" Ivan smirked. "I don't doubt it. I just don't pity them." The other men exchanged wary glances. "And why is that?" the storyteller asked. Ivan shrugged. "They lacked discipline. They didn't know when to stop. That's not greed. It's foolishness." The storyteller studied him. "And you think you could do better?" Ivan met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't think. I know." Silence settled over the room. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the wooden walls. Then the storyteller leaned forward. "Then why not prove it?" The words were like a challenge, an invitation. Ivan smiled. "Perhaps I will." And so he set out. The road was long. The journey was hard. But Ivan was patient. He was careful. He had learned from the mistakes of others. He would not fall into the same traps. 12 days later he arrived, and just as the stories had said, the Bashkirs greeted him with kindness and laughter. They feasted together, drinking deep into the night beneath a sky full of stars. And in the morning the elder stepped forward. "For 1,000 rubles," he said, "you may have all the land you can walk in one day. But you must return before sundown. Or you will lose everything." Ivan smiled. "I accept." At dawn, he stood at the starting point. The land stretched before him, golden and endless. The elder placed a small mound of earth at his feet. "Mark this well," he said. Ivan nodded. The sun rose, and he took his first step. He was careful. He chose his land wisely. A broad stretch of fertile fields, enough to feed generations. A river for water. A hill for his future home. He did not rush. He did not overreach. The sun climbed higher, and still he pressed on. He had planned everything perfectly. He would succeed. Where the others had failed, he would not make their mistakes. But then, beyond the river, he saw a grove of trees. Wood for building, he thought. I should take it. So he walked farther, and past the grove, a patch of wild horses grazed. With horses I could trade, he reasoned. A little more land won't hurt. So he walked farther. The sun burned high overhead. Sweat trickled down his back, but he was not worried. He had time. He had planned for this, hadn't he? When he finally turned back, a chill ran through him. The starting point was barely visible, and the sun, it was already past noon. His heart pounded. I still have time, he told himself. If he moved quickly, he could make it back. So he began to run. The land blurred around him, the golden fields stretching endlessly. His breath came in ragged gasps. His legs ached. The Bashkirs stood in the distance, waiting. The elder watched in silence. Ivan pushed forward, his body screaming for rest, but he could see the mound of earth now. Almost there. The sun touched the horizon. His vision swam. His chest ached. Just a little more. Darkness closed in at the edges of his sight. His legs buckled, but he would not stop. Not yet. Not now. With one final surge of strength, he lunged forward, his fingers grazing the mound of earth, and then silence. His body collapsed. His chest rose once, twice, and then nothing. The wind whispered. The world stood still. The Bashkir elder knelt beside him. He pressed his fingers to Ivan's throat, waited. Then he straightened. "It is done," he murmured. No one spoke. A young man retrieved a spade. The elder nodded. Without hesitation, they began to dig. The grave was shallow, just enough for a man to lie in. 6 feet of earth. "This," the elder said, "is all the land a man truly needs." He pressed the soil down, patting it firmly. The wind carried his words. "Away." The Bashkirs turned and walked back toward their camp, their figures fading into the twilight. The land remained unchanged. The fields stretched endlessly, golden beneath the darkening sky. It was still there, waiting for the next man to come. The days passed, and the land remained untouched, stretching endlessly beneath the ever-changing sky. The world carried on, indifferent to the fates of the men who had walked upon it, seeking to claim what was never theirs. The Bashkirs were gone now, leaving behind only the echoes of their presence. Their campfires had faded into the distance, their laughter no longer carried on the wind. The earth, however, had not forgotten. It had taken each man, one by one, without mercy or hesitation. And somewhere, in the distance, another man heard the tale. His name was Pavel. He was a farmer, strong of body and steady in his work. He had heard the stories, the whispers of men who sought more than their fair share, only to be swallowed by the very land they coveted. He had heard them all, but he had never truly believed. There was always another way, he thought. There was. Always a path that led to prosperity without losing oneself in greed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Pavel sat by his fire, his hands weathered from years of toil. The air was cool, and the smoke from his campfire curled into the twilight sky. He listened as the storyteller's voice filled the air, weaving the tale of Sergei and Ivan, of their greed, their ambition, and their eventual fall. Pavel's eyes narrowed as the words sank into his mind. "Greed," he muttered under his breath. "Foolishness. They should have known better." The storyteller turned toward him, sensing the quiet defiance in Pavel's tone. "You think you could do better?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. Pavel looked up, his gaze unflinching. "I know I could." The storyteller raised an eyebrow, as though pondering whether Pavel's words were more than empty bravado. After a long pause, he spoke. "Then prove it." The challenge hung in the air like a heavy weight. The men around the fire fell silent, watching with interest. Pavel sat for a moment, his mind working. His hands, calloused from years of labor, gripped the edge of his seat. "I will," he said at last, standing up with determination. "I will show you all that there is a way to take what you need without losing yourself in the process." The next day, Pavel began his journey. He walked the familiar roads, the path he had known for years. He passed the villages, the forests, the hills that rose and fell with the land. He had no intention of making the same mistakes as the others. He was not driven by a thirst for power or riches. He sought only what he needed, what was rightfully his. There was no greed in his heart. By the time he reached the Bashkirs' land, the sun had begun to set. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The Bashkirs greeted him with their usual warmth, offering him food and drink. They laughed and spoke in their native tongue, their voices blending with the rustling of the leaves. When the fire died down and the last of the feast was consumed, the elder approached Pavel. His face was calm, his expression unreadable. "For 1,000 rubles, the elder said, you may have all the land you can walk in one day, but you must return before sundown, or you will lose everything." Pavel looked at the elder, then at the land that stretched before him, the vast fields, the hills, the distant river. He smiled inwardly, knowing that this was not a test of greed, it was a test of balance. "I accept," he said. The next morning he stood at the starting point, the mound of earth at his feet. The air was crisp, the sun still low on the horizon. Pavel's heart was steady. He had no need for more than what he could use. The land was abundant, yes, but it was also enough. He took his first step, his feet steady on the earth. He moved with purpose, choosing the land carefully, a patch of fertile soil for crops, a grove of trees for timber, a stream for water. He marked his territory one step at a time. He did not rush. He did not overreach. The sun climbed higher, but Pavel moved with the rhythm of the land, never pushing beyond his means. He knew that there was enough for everyone. There was no need to take more than what was necessary. As the day wore on, Pavel felt the weight of the sun above him. He had chosen wisely, marking his land with precision and care. But as the shadows lengthened, he realized that the starting point was farther than he had anticipated. The sun was beginning its descent. He quickened his pace, but there was no panic in his movements. He had made his choices, and they were sound. He would return with what he had marked, and he would not lose himself in the desire for more. The mound of earth came into view. Pavel's legs were tired, his body aching, but he pressed on. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the land. He could see the Bashkirs in the distance, waiting. The elder stood silently, his eyes never leaving Pavel. With the last of his strength, Pavel made his way back to the starting point, his feet heavy but steady. He reached the mound of earth just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon. He had done it. The elder stepped forward, placing a hand on Pavel's shoulder. He smiled faintly, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You have learned the way," he said, and with that, the cycle continued. For the land remained, vast and endless, waiting for the next man to come. The years passed, and the land remained unchanged. The field stretched far beyond the horizon, golden in the sun's light, deep and endless beneath the night sky. It was a quiet, patient land, holding the secrets of the men who had tried and failed to claim it. But as the days drifted by, the land began to speak a little louder to those who still sought it. And in the distance, a new man appeared on the horizon. His name was Anatoly. He was a young man, barely older than a boy, with eyes full of ambition and a heart eager to prove itself. He had heard the stories, how the land had swallowed the greedy and the foolish, how Sergei, Ivan, and countless others had lost everything in their pursuit of more. But Anatoly did not believe these tales. He believed in his own strength, his ability to succeed where others had failed. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of color, Anatoly sat by a fire in the village. The air was still, and the night stretched before him, deep and wide. The men around the fire spoke of other lands, of riches and glory, but Anatoly's mind was focused on something else. The tale that had been told time and again. The tale of the land that could only be claimed by those who understood it. The storyteller's voice filled the air, steady and old, telling the story of the Bashkirs, of the 1,000 rubles, of the men who had walked the land and paid the price for their greed. Anatoly listened intently, his thoughts racing. "So you think you can do better?" the storyteller asked, turning his eyes on the young man. Anatoly smiled, his face full of confidence. "I know I can." The men around the fire shifted uncomfortably. But the storyteller did not look away. Instead, he studied Anatoly with a quiet, knowing gaze. "Then prove it," he said simply. And so, Anatoly made his decision. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the endless fields, Anatoly set out. His heart beat fast with excitement. He had heard the warnings, the tales of men who had failed, but he was different. He was smarter, he was stronger. He would take what was rightfully his without being consumed by greed. He walked the familiar path past the villages, the forests, the hills that had witnessed so many journeys before his. He moved with confidence, his feet sure, his steps swift. The time he reached the Bashkirs' land, the sun was high. The air was thick with the scent of earth, the hum of life, the sound of birds in the trees. The Bashkirs greeted him with their usual warmth, their voices deep and pleasant as they welcomed him to their camp. That night the fire crackled, and the men laughed and sang. The elder, his face grave and wise, observed Anatoly with quiet patience, waiting for the moment to come, and when the time was right, the elder stood. "For 1,000 rubles," he said, "you may have all the land you can walk in one day. But you must return before sundown, or you will lose everything." Anatoly's eyes sparkled with determination. "I accept," he said. The next morning the sun was rising as Anatoly stood at the starting point, the small mound of earth before him. His heart beat steadily in his chest, and he took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. He took his first step, his feet firm on the earth. He was ready. He moved with purpose, his mind focused on the task ahead. He marked the land carefully, choosing the spots that would serve him best: rich soil for crops, a grove of trees for timber, a stream for water. But as the day wore on, Anatoly began to grow bolder. He walked farther than he had planned, further than he needed to. He saw a hill in the distance, a perfect place for a home. Without hesitation he walked toward it, thinking only of how much more he could claim. The sun climbed higher, and Anatoly's steps grew quicker. He moved with a sense of urgency, not realizing that time was slipping away. The land stretched before him, vast and tempting. He could take more. He could have it all. As the sun reached its peak, Anatoly turned. His breath quickened. The starting point was a long way off now. He had walked too far. The hill was behind him, the trees beyond it. The stream was now out of sight. The sun had begun to dip toward the horizon. Anatoly's heart pounded in his chest. "I still have time," he told himself, but there was no calm in his voice. He started to run. The land blurred around him. His breath came in sharp gasps. He could see the mound of earth now, but it was still too far away. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the fields. He ran faster, his feet stumbling, his body straining. He could hear the Bashkirs in the distance, their voices quiet, watching from afar. The elder stood silently, waiting. With one final burst of energy, Anatoly reached the starting point, his hands brushing against the mound of earth just as the last sliver of the sun disappeared behind the horizon, but it was too late. He collapsed to the ground, his body trembling from exhaustion. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the echo of a fate that had already been sealed. The elder knelt beside him, pressing his fingers to Anatoly's throat. After a moment, he stood, his face calm and unreadable. "It is done," he said softly. The Bashkirs turned and walked away, their figures fading into the twilight. The land remained, stretching endlessly beneath the stars. Anatoly lay there, motionless, a part of the land now, just as Sergei, Ivan, and all the others had become. The earth, patient and eternal, had taken what it was owed, and the cycle continued.